I work at the Institute for Economic Justice, which is one of the institutes that are part of the Budget Justice Coalition. I also sit on the steering committee of the Budget Justice Coalition. So to begin, I will be providing you with an introduction to what is a human rights budget, and my colleagues will then take over from there to basically give you an overview of what we are envisioning with this budget. I think first to acknowledge that we stand on the shoulders of giants in creating this people's budget in a way, and that the history of South Africa's activism is quite strong, and that initiatives such as ours have been put forward before, and that we really are taking this forward in a new era. And we thank all those who have engaged in these sorts of activities and advocating for women, for the poor, and for South Africans to be included in budgetary processes. So what is a human rights budget? A human rights budget is a budget and budget process that is underpinned by the universal human rights to availability, to equality, freedom and dignity. We know that in South Africa that we are underpinned, or all our economic policies should be underpinned by the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, which are the cornerstones of the democracy in South Africa. These apply to political governance and to economic governance. The budget process is central to this, encapsulating economic policy, fiscal policy, monetary policy, revenue, trade, and tax policy, budget allocations, etc. Yet what we have identified is that there's a systematic exclusion of, or rather of the enjoyment of rights in the way in which the budget processes are undertaken. What we are trying to put forward here today is to reimagine a budget that really is about addressing human rights in this country. A human rights framework is different from the traditional orthodox ways in which we approach budgeting. In fact, it prioritizes people at the center of it and is environmentally sustainable and ensures that there's inclusive economic growth. This is not an end in itself, however. The budget must be evaluated not only according to narrow economic targets, as I've already indicated, but rather on what it has done to promote, protect, and fulfill and respect rights, in particular socio-economic rights. So in this document, we hope to share with you some of the ways that we are beginning to think about or have thought about collectively how the budget can meet human rights. I will now pass on to my colleague, Daniel McLaren, who works at the Section 27 and is also part of the steering committee of the Budget Justice Coalition. Section 27 is one of the organizations that are part of the Budget Justice Coalition.
Thank you, Busi. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining this press conference. So in the Imali Yesizwe Alternative People's Budget, we set out what the human rights framework is and how that applies to our economic and fiscal and budgetary policies. And we also look at what the status quo is, which we have to move on from. And the status quo that we've seen over the last 5 years, and we provide the data to show this, shows that unlike some of the mixed messages we've been hearing from government about its fiscal policy, which on the one hand, perhaps from the presidency, we hear is expansionary and is providing a stimulus to the economy. And on the other hand, we hear from the Treasury is focused on fiscal consolidation and spending cuts. What we see very clearly is that we do have a fiscal policy in South Africa over the last few years, which has been focused on austerity. It has been focused on an absolute prioritization of reducing debt as a percentage of GDP and as a deficit in the budget by reducing expenditure and implementing tax increases. This is what the definition of austerity is. It's tax increases and/or spending cuts in order to reduce government debt. So that's the fiscal policy which we have been implementing. And the data shows that, for example, if you look at non-interest expenditure, which is all expenditure except debt service costs, i.e. expenditure in the economy on government services and programs, non-interest expenditure per head of population has declined in real terms for 4 of the past 5 financial years. The only year when it increased, which was in 2019-20, was a result of record bailouts to Eskom and South African Airways of 65 billion rand, up from an average of about 10 to 15 billion rand in bailouts for the past, for the 5 years before that. So if you discount the bailouts to SOEs because they are essentially covering SOE debt, which has been accumulated because of looting and mismanagement, then government expenditure per head of population has actually been declining in every year of the past 5 years. So what's this resulted in, and what has been accelerated in the supplementary budget proposals to deal with COVID is massive cuts to spending on socio-economic rights, which we think as BJC is a violation of the constitutional obligations to progressively realize these rights. So we've seen cuts, for example, on school infrastructure. In the latest budget, school infrastructure was cut by 2 billion rand. It was the single largest cut in the entire budget. And I just want participants to think about what the impact of this is on individual schools and learners and communities, but also on the economy at large. And this is why austerity is so problematic. When you cut the school infrastructure budget, what happens is that planned school infrastructure projects are cancelled. We have seen this in Limpopo and Eastern Cape, where the poorest schools, the most underserved communities, are being told that their school building projects, new classrooms, extra space, refurbished roofs, new toilets, new sanitation, which is safe, are being cancelled. Now, what this means is that a company, perhaps a Black-owned company, construction company, doesn't get a contract for that project. That means that the workers in that company may be laid off. That means that the families of those workers don't receive an income. That means that the children in those families not only now have to attend a school which still has illegal and unsafe sanitation, but may also now be facing hunger as a result of the loss of income to the family. And this results in poorer learning, and this results in intergenerational poverty, which reinforces all of the inequalities which already exist in our society. This is the reality of the budget proposals, which were put forward by the Minister Mboweni in February and again in June, and which we expect to be put forward once again in the MTBPS next week. So as BJC, we are calling for an end to this really negative death spiral of cuts upon cuts. We think that the only way we're going to see a rebound in the economy and social services is if we put a stop to these cuts, if we fund the agencies which need funding, such as the NPA, SARS, and Statistics South Africa, all of which are currently experiencing budget cuts. And if we fund key socioeconomic rights. So the key demands that we're making in relation to this switch to a budget which prioritizes rights is that we must maintain per capita expenditure on key social programs. This covers health, housing, education, social development, and other areas. We must, instead of focusing just on this abstract idea of debt sustainability, which even the economists can't agree what that is, we should rather be focusing on the composition of expenditure. How are we actually allocating resources in the budget? Are we spending on the right things? This is where the focus should be, not just cutting across the board, which damages public services, which damages what capacity there is in the public service and makes all of the reforms that we want to do even harder. The spending reviews associated with zero-based budgeting should already be institutionalized. It's crazy to think that we are spending money but not reviewing the quality of that expenditure. There's nothing wrong with spending reviews. In fact, they're very, very important. But instead of this idea of there are no holy cows, actually, we must be protecting social expenditure and we must be focusing on the composition of expenditure instead. simply reducing it. Of course, we need to double down and actually rid corruption and wasteful expenditure from the balance sheet, and we need to deliver tax justice. We need to be asking those with the best means to pay, with high net wealth, assets, and incomes at the top of our distribution, who are the least impacted economically from the current crisis, to cover the cost of debt reduction, not people covering that cost through cuts to their public services. Thank you. Back to Pussy.
Thank you, Daniel. I think I will be next covering how we need to move from an austerity budget to a human rights budget. We are currently in a global pandemic, which has showed that we need to spend better on people, and that has shown that neoliberal economic policies have failed to reduce multidimensional poverty and allowed for inequality to increase and extreme wealth to flourish. The South African government has done quite a bit during this time to try and curb some of these impacts, but we believe that more can be done. We believe, as the Budget Justice Coalition, that we need to reimagine the economy for the realization of human rights. We have seen that this can be done during this time. We need to fix the flaws in the South African economy itself. It is not just a fiscal issue, but rather a macroeconomic and social policy issue at large. We would like to see that resources are invested towards South Africans at this moment. And now I'll cover some of the expenditure recommendations that we have, or rather how we envision a human rights budget in terms of expenditure. Very important and critical is to acknowledge that universal basic services are critical to the realization of human socio-economic rights. We need to start thinking about the expenditure on universal basic services as an investment rather than just expenditure. We need to also challenge the idea that expenditure on social, or rather social expenditure, does not have high fiscal multipliers. In our human rights budget, we do not see a distinction between social and economic expenditure. In fact, social expenditure is economic expenditure because it is an investment. In our human rights budget, we see that zero-based budgeting is a tool that government is attempting to use to implement austerity. And in the absence of a human rights costing exercise, we do not understand how and when they will preserve expenditure for human rights. So therefore, in our human rights budget, we do not advocate for a a zero-based budgeting approach to dealing with the current economic issues. In fact, we do not understand how the zero-based budgeting is meant to solve some of the key capacity issues, as well as developmental capacity issues that the government currently faces. So our human rights budget sees itself as saying, what is it that we really need to solve? So going forward, we see that we need to meet the right to basic education. Basic education has been the net loser many a times. So in our human rights budget, we advocate for more expenditure in the basic education, as we see this as an investment that has higher returns in the future. In terms of early childhood development, which is largely run by NPOs and mostly by Black women, we believe that it is critical that government focus their efforts towards early childhood development. We have seen that during the COVID crisis, a lot of these centers have been in crisis. So it is therefore critical that more expenditure and in fact care is given to the early childhood development sector. In terms of social security, our goal in a human rights budget is for a universal basic income for all. And in fact, in this document, we advocate for the extension of the caregiver grants, as well as the other grants that were increased earlier for the immediate run. But our vision for a human rights budget is that there's a universal basic income for all. And in fact, this develops into a living wage in the future. In terms of the right to food, we know that many people are precarious right now, and it is critical that government begin to think about how to implement. In fact, social grants, as I've already mentioned, are very helpful in a way to address the right to food. We believe this is critical and that government must deal with this, and that's what a human rights budget must do. So as we've seen in the COVID response, there's not been further interventions in terms of ensuring that the right to food is met. The right to water and sanitation, there's been a lot of issues around capacity and implementation of water and sanitation. In fact, South Africa will not meet the Sustainable Development Goals. And so in our human rights budget, we prioritize the ability to develop capacity and developmental capacities to be able to meet the needs of the majority of South Africans. We also discuss the right to a healthy environment. In fact, we talk about the inequality that has been caused by spatial apartheid that needs to be readdressed, that makes poor people live in areas that are not as environmentally healthy as the wealthy and white. We also talk about a just transition, how we need to invest in green technologies and energy in the future. In fact, Eskom must be decisively dealt with, and the details, of course, are therefore in our document. But I think also critically, we talk about spending to transform gender relations, which is something that we have not seen in the budget. There has been a lack of gender responsive budgeting in South Africa for over a decade. We talk about how the plan, the National Strategic Plan to prevent GBVF needs to be funded. And in fact, last year, when the president announced that there'd be funding allocated to the prevention of GBVF, we did not see new expenditure in this. And therefore, in our human rights budget, we advocate for increased expenditure to decisively deal with GBVF. We also talk about the need to spend on care work particularly, which is important and critical to the participation of women in the labor market, but also important for the protection of women. It has shown, ITUC has shown that 2% of expenditure on the care economy can create 400,000 jobs. That is half of the jobs that the president has promised to create. Therefore, we propose that this is a critical area that needs to be looked at, not only just for gender equity, but for women to also be able to realize their rights. Women are more likely to be entrapped in poverty when they undertake care work extensively for many years without social protection. We also discuss mental health. As we know, the crisis has led to another crisis, which has always been a crisis, mental health. We know that austerity led to an increase of 36% for men and women in suicide rates in Greece. And we've seen with the Needs Camp data that mental health crisis is on the surge in South Africa. Therefore, in our human rights budget, we prioritize mental health as a key area that needs investment. We talk about state-owned entities and the need to decisively deal with these. It is important that we see state-owned entities and determine which goods need to be publicly provisioned versus privately provisioned. And it is critical that our government deal with the current state-owned entities. So in this, we propose some ways in which Eskom and so forth can be resolved, in particular with regards to their management. And lastly, we talk about infrastructure-led growth, and we caution against blended finance as a way of going forward. We have seen in the proposal that the government has put forward that blended finance, and some people, of course, it's about de-risking private sector. So one of our critical arguments is that there's been a tendency to prioritize private sector over, for instance, human rights. And it is important that we approach blended finance with caution. So these are the ways in which we propose that expenditure can change in a way that is towards realizing human rights for all in South Africa. And of course, like I said, the details are in the document, and we don't have time to go through our document, which is over 80 pages long. I will now pass over to Dominic Brown from AIDC, who also sits on the steering committee, and he will be discussing how we plan to fund our human rights budget.
Thank you, Busi, and good morning to everyone. So I would like to start out by saying that as Imali Yesizwe, we think that it's critical to understand debt as a structural issue, which requires a systematic response through the transformation of the economy itself. The issue of South Africa's debt permeates throughout the South African economy and is one of the main arguments used by Treasury to legitimize harsh austerity and the deepening of a neoliberal macroeconomic framework. Cutting expenditure or increasing regressive taxes when tax revenue is falling due to the economic climate depresses tax revenue or spending in the private and public sectors, which determines the growth and the size of the GDP. Because debt levels are measured as a ratio of debt to GDP, if measures to tackle debt lead to exacerbate poor economic growth, then debt relative to GDP will go up, not down, and the fiscal consolidation or austerity approach by Treasury will lead to an inevitable failure on its own terms. Besides the inevitable failure of Treasury's way of addressing the growing debt, it further does not acknowledge that the alternative ways to address the public debt and growing debt to GDP ratio. In the context of needing to finance a just recovery for a people's budget, Imali Yesizwe, and towards protecting and advancing socio-economic rights, we propose 4 proposals linked to an alternative strategy to address the debt issue in a sustainable way, including the need for greater transparency and accountability, the public disclosure of loan agreements, the terms of the agreements, and the conditionalities attached to them should be mandatory. An independent audit of South Africa's debt is necessary to assess whether any loans have been incurred against the interests of the majority of South Africans, and or if there are any corrupt transactions linked to these loans. Even the business press acknowledges that South Africa's debt, or much of South Africa's debt, is potentially corrupt, even if they don't question whether these debts should be paid back at all. We also need, secondly, stricter capital controls. 3, a fiscal stimulus and investment towards enhancing productive capacity. And 4th, increased progressive taxation. In addition to these key proposals linked to addressing debt in a sustainable way, the consensus is that the realization of human rights is impossible without fiscal policies that include tax measures to redress inequalities and guarantee adequate resources. The International Covenant for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights states that governments should enforce progressive tax systems and prevent business activities which result in abuses of covenant rights or where a failure to act with due diligence to mitigate the risks allows infringements to occur. Therefore, in Imali Yesizwe, we propose increased progressive taxation. While we note that it is expected that revenue collections will be 304 billion rand lower than estimated in the February 2020 budget, the level of under-collection expected this year is dramatic and largely can be attributed to the South African and global economic downturn. However, since 2013-14, the South African Revenue Services has consistently collected lower revenues than forecast. Here, the role of corruption and the closure of the SARS large business center, as well as the hollowing out of SARS's capacity through the dismissal of more than 2,000 employees, cannot be overstated. It is important that SARS continues to restore its integrity that it had before the Zuma years. Furthermore, it's critical that Treasury provides SARS with adequate resources to ensure that it can effectively fulfill its mandate, including the filling of 600 to 800 critical vacancies. In addition to increasing SARS capacity, given the economic recession, turning to the implementation of a net wealth tax is essential. The following is required to reform wealth taxes: committing to develop a plan for the implementation of a permanent annual wealth tax. Further, in terms of income taxes on high income earners and high net worth individuals, who have experienced significant growth in their income over the past 2 decades, increasing personal income tax on the 2 highest brackets and adjusting the remaining 2 brackets below inflation. In the immediate term, government must take the opportunity of a model high ground by increasing taxes on high incomes above 500,000 Rand per year. Moreover, in the relation to income derived from wealth, we should look to revise the primary abatement for estates of 6 million and clamping down on the abuse of trusts to shield individuals from paying their full estate duty. Capital gains taxes should also be restructured so that the capital gains rate is increased above the OECD or in line with the OECD and BRICS norms over the medium term. Finally, at least four additional areas for revenue, for greater revenue to pay for a human rights budget includes combating illicit financial flows, base erosion, and profit shifting, and the implementation of capital controls to slow down the level of financial outflows. A recent estimate by the Financial Intelligence Center estimated that South Africa loses between $10 billion and $25 billion to illicit financial flows, base erosion, and profit shifting each year. Putting an end to profit shifting and wage evasion and the stricter implementation of the general anti-avoidance rule can go a long way in raising greater revenues for the implementation of a human rights budget. We also think in the medium term that we need to increase the corporate income tax rate as well as looking to end corruption and the outsourcing of procurement. Finally, we also think that a contribution holiday to the government employees pension fund could also raise significant amount of resources to the equivalent of 120 billion Rand over the next 3 years. Thank you, Pusi.
Thank you, Dominic. Just to emphasize that we believe as part of the International Convention on Economic and Socio-Economic Rights, that domestic resource mobilization is key to realizing human rights at a domestic level. I'll now be passing on to Esther Msindo, who's a BJC member from the Public Service Accountability Monitor, who will discuss with us on budget reform proposals.
Thank you, Lucy, and good morning, everyone. Yes, I'm going to speak to budget reform and what we think a human rights budget should prioritize. 3 key issues I'm going to talk to: fiscal transparency, public participation, parliamentary oversight, and the role of supreme audit institutions. As Imali Yesizwe, we acknowledge the reforms that have been done by government thus far since 1994, which include the decentralization of budgeting process to national, provincial, and municipal level, and the implementation of the medium-term expenditure framework and multi-year budgeting. Also, we acknowledge the legislative reforms that have been undertaken through the PMFMA and Treasury regulations. We, however, think that human rights budget should see reform which account for the need for more progressive, inclusive, human rights-centered alignment of South Africa's decentralized budgets with its development needs. We acknowledge that there is technical and specialized nature of government budget planning and execution. And for example, planning for health and education budgets require all spending proposals to be collated into a single process to allow side-by-side comparison of various bids. political, economic, and social judgments are made to inform spending priorities. The National Treasury uses revenue forecast to produce the fiscal framework that contains projections of expenditure, amongst others. The fiscal framework determines what is available for public spending and is approved by the cabinet. The legislatures and public are informed via the medium-term policy statement of changes of revisions to the fiscal framework. We realize that international measures call South Africa's overall budget execution highly, but this does not apply or is not the same at provincial and municipal level. We note that a key benefit of increased transparency is a situation where we have the legislature passes a budget and with a comprehensive understanding or information about how the budget is being implemented by the agent, which is the government, which is what we think is not the case at the moment. And fiscal transparency will have a huge effect on mitigating against information constraints, limiting poor budget execution and extent to which departments may divert spending in ways not consistent with Parliament approval. We also know that the National Treasury agrees that they need to engage more with organizations like SALGA, and officials are invited to participate in a range of meetings. However, the absence of local civil society, social formations, and those most affected by weaknesses in budget planning is a major concern that must be remedied. The participation of non-state actors must constitute a central and not peripheral aspect. On fiscal transparency, we note that South Africa has been rated high in terms of fiscal transparency, given the Open Budget Survey that was released in 2019, with South Africa scoring about 87 out of 100 in transparency, but we note that it scored 24 out of 100, a dismal performance on public participation. So more needs to be done, and better mechanisms for citizen participation and improved accountability on the part of government must be identified. The 2017 OBS warned that there was a need for South Africa to safeguard its hard-won transparent status following post-apartheid budget reforms. The OBS contents could be achieved by ensuring that the integrity of institutions such as the South African Reserve Bank, the National Treasury, and South African Revenue Services are protected and bolstered. The lack of transparency and disclosure by governments of their financial risk is cited as a contributing factor in many countries' fiscal crisis, highlighting the importance of openness. We urge the committees that engage in finance to engage the Office of the Auditor General on measures to establish formal mechanisms for the public to assist in the development of its audit program and to contribute to relevant audit investigations. The BJC reassessed Minister Mbowen's MTBPS 29 remarks, in which he signaled Treasury's recognition of the need to bolster state capacity. This involves enhancing the capacity of the National Prosecuting Authority and the South African Revenue Service in order to combat corruption and improve revenue collection. While much has changed since the MTBS, the capacity of these institutions to fulfill their mandate and respond to highly dynamic socio-economic contexts is as imperative as ever. Strong public institutions are needed to steer South Africa out of this period of crisis towards long-term sustainable development. Committees must therefore influence active engagement by the executive of vulnerable and underrepresented communities, directly or through civil society groupings. The OBS recommends that this should include providing feedback on how public inputs collected during pre-budget consultations and budget implementation are implemented by the government. The COVID-19 pandemic has shown that there is need for provincial departments to spend significant additional amounts of money to curb the impact of the virus. And so the practices at the provincial levels in particular of slow and or non-disclosure of key fiscal information, weak accountability, poor expenditure management, and historically limited public engagement have exacerbated barriers for monitoring by civil actors and oversight entities alike. With regards to participation processes, the Constitution obliges the legislature to conduct its business in an open manner and hold its sittings and those of its committees in public. We think a human rights budget is centered on social accountability, and social accountability obliges the state to prioritize the effective use of public resources to fulfill commitments to addressing poverty and inequality. Social accountability principles also emphasize public resource management processes that are inclusive of and accountable to the public. In a functional social accountability context, systematically marginalized groups are prioritized, not just in budget prioritization, but in the actual decision-making processes. People's right to engage and question elected representatives, public officials, and private actors on budgetary and policy decisions is central. On parliamentary oversight and the role of supreme audit, we think that national budgets are tabled in Parliament, not as sealed deals, but as policy commitments for approval by the legislative arm of the state. Budget priorities must also be open to public input, given that they are intended to serve the developmental needs of the people. So enabling through thorough scrutiny and debate on priorities set in the budget process is therefore crucial and cannot continue in its current forms. And the Auditor General has an important role to play, and reports of the Auditor General are therefore critical for evaluating the performance of the executive and of accounting officers in particular. I thank you.
Yeah, and I think all of the people watching will get all those further details. I think just to emphasize on the participatory nature of the budget, as part of our campaign in developing this human rights budget, we opened for public inputs. And if you look at our document, in orange, there are sections which are direct quotations from people who wanted to input and how they wanted to see the budget. We believe this is going to begin to show in real ways how government can begin opening those spaces. I think just to close, before we take questions, it is critical that we re-emphasize that challenging the current status quo of inequality, poverty, unemployment, and violence requires expansionary fiscal policies, ones that are human rights based, ones that are environmentally progressive, and it requires policy that is gender transformative. Human rights should not be a byproduct, or realizing human rights rather, should not be considered a byproduct of economic growth. In fact, it should be center to economic growth. This, of course, needs to take into account state capacity, corruption, and so forth. And we are much aware of that. And just to close off, I thought I'd read from the 1996 Constitution, which was adopted after an unprecedented public debate and consultation process. Its key goals are to, quote, heal the division of the past and establish a society based on democratic values, social justice, and fundamental human rights. Lay the foundation for a democratic and open society in which government is based on the will of the people and every citizen is equally protected by law. Improve the quality of life of all citizens and free the potential of each person, and build a united and democratic South Africa able to take its rightful place as a sovereign state in the family of nations. I will close there and to say that our human rights budget centers these sentiments and proposes a way forward. We'll now take questions. If people from the media would like to ask questions, there's a questions and answers function, and there's also ability to send questions to the panelists in the chat. There's a first question here from Mark Hayward. It says, how do you intend to interact with the Treasury on your proposals and with the legislature? What is the response of organized business to human rights-based budgets? I will begin and will open to all the panelists with me here to also respond. So the first one I'll respond to is what is the response of organized business? And so to say that we have not engaged organized business at this point in time. And in fact, we are opening and we are open to hearing from various communities and groups around our human rights budget, as is with the practice of participatory budget. We're keen to hear what people have to say, what their critiques are, and what the improvements and suggestions are. That is a critical element of why we've put this forward to people to be able to comment as well over the next while. I'll pass on to my fellow panelists here to also answer and have an opportunity to answer to the questions.
Thanks for the question from Mark. To respond, BJC has tried to engage with the Treasury directly in the past. We had a meeting with then Minister of Finance, Malusi Gigaba, back in 2018. But apart from that, and apart from letters which have been written to the Minister of Finance over the last 2 years, we haven't found a platform in which we can engage directly with the Treasury outside of Parliament. And that's one of the key budget reforms which we propose in the human rights budget in the final section, which Austerity was speaking to, which is that the decisions on the budget are made way before it's presented in Parliament. And in fact, they're actually made to a large extent between June, when Treasury issues guidelines to departments, and October, when Treasury gives the outline in the MTPPS of what the overall budget in the following February is going to look like. And so if we're actually going to have a participatory budget process, we need to open up spaces during that period for civil society, lobbies of different kinds, community organizations at different levels in local, provincial, and national budget processes, so that there can truly be a sharing of information and exchange of perspectives. We have, for example, written to the Treasury asking for a seat at the table for education organizations when we found out that education infrastructure spending was going to get the biggest cut in the budget. But the Treasury DG refused that request to be part of the current budget process. That's the medium-term expenditure committees. So this is a key reform which needs to happen. BJC has therefore engaged mainly through Parliament, but we've found that the post-budget engagements in Parliament are kind of superficial and superfluous to the budget process. We have had responses from Treasury to our submissions in those engagements, which don't really deal with the substance of our submission and don't really engage on that basis. So we think that there is a need for different kind of engagement on the budget. And depending on what is put forward in the MTBPS, if it is a really deep fiscal consolidation and budget cuts, then of course we need to be nimble on our feet in deciding what our right response is. If it's going to mean that rights are being infringed, then maybe we need to be thinking of a different kind of response to these budget proposals.
Yeah, and there's some other questions here, which I think my other colleagues that I can actually directly send to them. The one is, does a federal job guarantee fit into any of this human rights budget thinking? And I mean, I can give a quick answer to say that we haven't necessarily explicitly included this, and it's not because we don't think it's important. A number of organizations who are part of the Budget Justice Coalition have done work on this sort of project around, expanding, public works, but also just jobs guarantee. I think it is critical to also understand that the BJC is constrained in particular ways in terms of trying to develop these things, and that maybe this is a shameless cry, but to say that it is critical that our civil society is supported to be able to do this work, which is actually critical as well to state capacity. If civil society can provide critical analysis of certain issues, in fact, we are providing alternative views of how we can do things differently. And just to say that for the February budget, we are thinking about how to expand sort of the ideas that are in this initial document, and that we hope that you'll see the jobs guarantee program in that next version. And I don't know if Dominic would like to add. I know this is sort of, something you care about deeply.
No, thank you, Busi. I think you've covered the gist of it, that a human rights budget, and is Imali Yesizwe, and in dealing with many of the socio-economic issues, poverty, mass unemployment, and inequality are three of the key ones, not without also understating the massive impacts of the ecological crisis. And so when putting human rights budget together, employment opportunities and creating dignified work is a key aspect. And I think we are a democratic space, and it takes time to always come to consensus or a view on one thing very quickly. But I think it's a key aspect of jobs in our budget justice going forward.
Thank you. And just to note that we'll finish at 12 o'clock. We know we started a bit late, and this is going longer than expected. There's a question here: how do we advocate that human rights budget takes a hybrid approach, pro-poor and pro-growth, given government priorities and forever declining public resources? And I'll read another one so that our panelists can respond to a number of questions. What is the BJC perspective on balanced budget and budget deficits? And there's a question around borrowing remains one of the biggest problems we face. Are we monitoring the terms and conditions in relation to this? My reasoning is that this will impact heavily on the government can do within these terms. So those are, I guess, can be generally grouped around debt itself, but also what was the first one? Sorry, around growth rather. So I'll let my colleagues, I don't know if you'd like me to start, or if you'd like to. I know Dominic wrote particularly on that section as well. So I'll give Dominic the head start, and then Daniel and I will comment after.
Thanks again, Pusi. In terms of debt, I think one of the important things that we agree on as the BJC is that while the growing debt is a concern, debt in and of itself is not necessarily a problem. If debt is incurred to invest in productive capacity, if it's used to spend on essential services and to provide essential services, then in fact it can have positive medium-term impacts. So that's the first thing. Secondly, in terms of the rising budget deficit and the rising debt to GDP ratio, we think that we need greater transparency in relation to these debts and the terms and conditions. So, which relates to the second question, and that is, as much as we would like to monitor, it's not very easy to do it because it's not always easy to access the information. So, for example, recently we were able to look at the repayments to the World Bank in relation to the ESCOM loan for Medupi, but of late, the information is no longer available online. So these are some of the challenges that you can experience in trying to monitor and ensure accountability when it comes to the terms and conditions of the loans. And that's why one of the main demands that we have is for greater transparency through the public disclosure of these loan agreements and the conditionalities that may be attached to them.
Daniel, would you like to add?
Yeah, thanks. I'll take the question on the balanced budget. So I think, as Toko, BJC member, has said in the commentary, we need to be thinking about these ideas a bit differently. So the issue at the moment is that the idea of the balanced budget and Tito Mbowene's commitment to achieve actually a primary budget surplus, which is the most extreme kind of austerity, where you actually aim to reduce your expenditure to a level where it's below revenue and then use the difference to pay back debt. We need to change the focus. So for example, the focus at the moment is unduly on one indicator, which is debt, which is debt to GDP or the amount of borrowing we have to undertake each year to fill the budget deficit. Now the focus on debt, on reducing debt, is on spending cuts. We need to reduce government expenditure. That means less borrowing. That means less debt. But what we're arguing is that a balanced budget would actually focus on a much wider range of things. So for example, why not close the budget deficit, and why not fund the realization of the economy and socio-economic rights by, instead of cutting public services and cutting expenditure, which the majority of people rely on and which is essential for the recovery, why not require those who have the means to pay to cover that gap? And we can and we should do that because it's essential to redistribute resources in a highly skewed economy. By focusing on cutting expenditure, which is the focus of the budget, the Treasury is talking about moderate tax increases and severe spending cuts. We are only going to worsen inequality. We are only going to therefore undermine the very basis for long-term economic growth. And so that to us would be more balanced, focusing on mobilizing resources from savings, from wealth and high incomes, and from and also by mobilizing resources by capacitating SARS. We know that SARS is saying that it could collect far more resources from foreign dividends, for example, from money which is shifted abroad, but it's lost the capacity to do so. So there's an element of spending money to make more money back, which the kind of austerity mindset of we must cut spending at all costs doesn't play into. The second thing is that rather than focusing on spending cuts only, we should, a balanced budget would also focus on growth. And of course, the growth has to be environmentally sustainable. We don't need to make trade-offs anymore between the environment and growth. Green budgeting and the Green New Deal shows that actually the way forward in terms of inclusive growth, in terms of employment intensive growth, is this just transition from a high carbon economy, which is polluting and destroying the environment, to a greener economy. And is also good for consumers because we know the green economy now will produce cheaper electricity. than Eskom can. So those are the ways that we would like to see the budget balanced. And what we're saying at the moment is that it's far too focused on spending cuts, and that those aren't the right recipe to get us away from where we are.
Thank you, Daniel. And I think just to close with regards to the pro-poor and pro-growth, I think Daniel's began touching on that. We believe that austerity is basically not going to give us the growth that we need. Kate Raworth, who's the author of Donut Economics, talks about how developing countries still need to grow. And I think critically what we try to address in this document is to say, this is the kind of growth we want. We want a growth that is pro-poor. We want a growth that is green. We want a growth that is gender transformative. And these are the ways in which we can get there. And these are the resources we can use through the fiscal policy to get there. So these are not competing, as already indicated, right? Focusing on human rights is not an anti-growth, but critically, as we know, growth in economics for the most part has been about growth for growth's sake. And what we try to challenge is this neoliberal paradigm, right? To say the growth can look different. And just to close off to say that this requires a new way of thinking and re-informing the presidency, the Reserve Bank, SARS, the DTI, and so forth about human rights and how they need to be central to everything, to our planning, to our implementation, to our monitoring and evaluation strategies. And that is critical in where we're going. And to say that we haven't done nearly enough, especially over the last decade, to be able to realize human rights efficiently, or rather adequately in the South African context, and that we are proposing an alternative way of going about this. Just to close, finally, to say that we are looking for organizations to endorse this submission, and that it will be available on our website. So please do read the longer document, which I've already indicated is over 80 pages long. So a lot of research and detailed research has gone into writing this document. And the Budget Justice Coalition, of course, is composed of more than 14 organizations, and there've been contributors who are also non-BJC members. And so we ask that people read this document and organizations to then endorse our documents. Thank you for joining us today. And we look forward to engaging with you on this budget, and we look forward to hearing from you about what you think, what we could add, and what we could have written differently. We do want to practice participatory budgeting in our own capacity as the Budget Justice Coalition. Thank you, everyone.